So my name is Mark Arnold. I provide all security leadership at a multi-cloud company called Navisite. That's who I am, but today I'm going to be two people because my co-presenter could not make it at the last minute. So what was going to be a conversation that started out at Black Hat maybe 2 years ago will be kind of a soliloquy between myself and myself, kind of pontificating points that he has around hacking intelligence. Now, just for preliminaries, I come at it from a CISO practitioner, leadership, and also from an academic side as a linguist. I'm trained in Middle Eastern languages. He's coming from the same topic as a military-trained intelligence person. And we've come together to say, can you hack intelligence or can you not do so? I say you need to hack it out of necessity. He says it cannot be hacked. So that's kind of framing the conversation that I'll have with myself today. Okay. Just a few introductions. I already told you who I am. Will has an incredible bio. He's known out there, worked at a number of companies, McAfee, Damballa, Cassandra, Digital Shadows, and most recently Digital Guardian. He's got a book out. Go check it out. He may be watching somewhere remotely. Now, we want to start off by saying, if you're not watching or not reading the intelligence, then you're flying blind. Does anyone know where this comes from or seen this? So the context for Jay Johnson's comment has to do with has to do with our leadership around daily reading of the intelligence. Regardless of what side of the political aisle you fall down, if you're not reading the intelligence, you're flying blind. Well, what does it look like? Anyone recognize security wizardry? Hands, some of the old schoolers? Yes. Just one person? Wow. We must be a little bit old, but it's okay. It was the genius of Andy Cobb. He thought about this concept maybe about 14, 16 years ago in a bathtub in a bathroom. And now folks all over the world are using it. I used it back in the day, I must confess, to make sure my IDS signatures were up to date. And I also made sure to look at it to make sure my Nmap version was up to date. I don't know, it might be, something to target, but there are some other more modern dashboards. I won't call out who these belong to, but if you look around on the internet, you'll understand who these are. Is intelligence, does it really look like this, right? When you walk into the office, what should it look like? I'm coming at this conversation from the side that many of us in the room don't have access to the intel that would be relevant for us to protect our particular organizations. And I borrow from Mark Orlando's talk at RSA in 2015. Typically, when you look at getting the intel that's relevant, it's going to cost you money. Would you say yes? If you look at it from left to right, open source is typically free. Community projects are free, low-end dollars. You start looking at commercial, you're starting to shell out more money to get vendor-specific, moderate, targeted intelligence. And then on the far end, internal, when you're kind of have a closed, internally sourced system, it's going to cost you money because you need people, you need resources, you need trained individuals who can not just gather and collect the data, but also make sense and analyze the data. It's not only about economics, but it's also about bureaucracy. So there are bureaucratic barriers. If you're not on the intelligence side, how do you get at the data that's being collected at the agencies? There's competition around whose data is the best data, the right data. Cultural differences, how do you handle the data? How is data handled from one agency to the other? And then do you have a security clearance? Can you get at the data? What are the preconditions under which data is shared, okay? And so not just cost, but bureaucracy and red tape. Typically, if you're on the outside of that conversation and you need access, maybe sharing is the way to go. So friends with benefits. How many of you know about the Open Thread Exchange? Just let me raise your hands real high, just 1 second. So only that many people know about the OTX? Okay. There's OTX. Facebook has exchanges. Common mention today has been Shodan. That's probably look at that as an exchange for collecting scans. ZMAP, others. Intrigue.io by Jonathan Cran at Kenna are ways to kind of get at this. But look what this end user says. I mean, it seems like OTX database is a crowdsourced list of suspicious sites, but as with a lot of anti-malware software or sites like this, it provides little insight into how severe the threat is because of lack of context. There's something missing there. So you can have all these disparate pieces of data, but if you don't have the context, then is it meaningful or relevant for your particular organization? There are local and regional agencies like ARIC out in Austin, but again, does this get us around the barriers of getting into the relevant intel that we need to protect our orgs? This was a comment on a website reviewing orgs like ARIC saying fusion centers typically in the beginning are tasked at helping us share our data, to bring data together, to collectively solve this problem around getting at the right intel. But at the end of the day, sometimes it gets fused in with other intelligence or local enforcement priorities and so forth, such that it gets watered down and loses its impetus. And then there are those who determine for themselves to use closed-sourced methods. So I was also at Optiv before I was at this current company. I walked into a well-known health provider. They didn't want to have anything to do with our sales pitch, because vendors are saying, if you take our solution, you're going to have the best threat intelligence, the best relevance for your particular organization. They said, no, we're going to take this internal because we want to make sure that the data that we're seeing that's relevant for us has impetus, has impact for our particular business and org. ISACs, I'm sure everyone in the room knows about ISACs. High barrier, high end cost, but for many CISOs, and I was with a group of CISOs about 2 weeks ago, ISACs are highly valued because it's closed, pretty much closed group of orgs, and you have the ability to begin to foster trust among the various providers and various sharers in that room. But for many of us, getting into that room costs money. FSISAC costs a lot of money, NHISAC not so much money, but it costs money to get into that room to have access to that data. So the economics is quite involved in that particular instance. How many of you in the room know about apt.threattracking.com? I see a couple of hands. So this is an attempt to gather intelligence from various sources. I don't know if you had to barter with a vendor, a compromise assessment provider that would say, if you want this level of taxonomy, you've got to pay the gold standard. If you want an additional level of taxonomy, you have to pay platinum costs. This site is run by Halvor Flake, and if you go in there, you'll see all the APTs, you'll see all the Russian hackers, the Chinese threat actors, all lined up with the various compromise tactics that they use to get into organizations. It's live right now. You can go out right now. You'll see a number of people in there kind of adding data to this particular document. But this is a way for some to get around the barriers of cost, the barriers of bureaucracy. If Will were here standing next to me, and I'm going to start the conversation now, Will would say this is not prudent, it's not responsible that someone would be collecting this data in an open forum and sharing that out. But Halvor has this disclaimer Attribution is a very complex issue. This list is intent to map together the findings in a single incident analysis. And so if you can't get at the data and you're curious about the taxonomies, you can find them here, but is that a responsible way around getting, a way of getting to data that normally costs money to get to these resources? For me, there's also bias when we talk about intel sources. So, wish I had a clicker here. First one, basically, there's political bias. Lucifer and the Bears. This notion of hacking political processes. The second one is kind of near and dear to me. I'm from Boston. When the Boston bombing happened, there was a lot of image intel on the internet, and so what happened is a crowdsourced kind of sleuthing took place, whereas this gentleman, Sunil Tripathi, was incorrectly picked out as the bomber and caused quite a greater grief upon his family. And so even as you're collecting all this data, all this intel, in some instances we have bad outcomes based on who's actually handling the intel. And then finally, there's semantic bias in our artificial intelligence. That's the big thing here, NLP, natural language processing. It's helping us to get at the resource problem, but as Arvind, Professor Narayan at Princeton would say, it's also easily able to be impacted with bias. And we have a situation where these artificial intelligence systems may be ingesting a lot of bias. I want to kind of pause here to give you an example of what that might be. So in the book Waters, 2016, they used what was called named entity recognition to extract information on orgs, people, and places out of Facebook. Think about the recent troubles with Facebook and how hackers and threat actors are extracting bits of information out of those social media repositories and kind of using that as weapons or weaponizing that data to attack certain groups. And so with named entity resolution, you see here kind of forefronted here locations, times, persons, organizations, money, percent, and data. Hopefully after this talk, I'm going to be releasing some data where this is applied on some social media platforms. But one thing that this does not do very good is provide context. So you have the data extracted, but you need context. And so this example on the end is the very first verse, because in the same book, Waters uses some biblical examples. I pulled one of my own. This is the very first verse out of the Bible in Hebrew, right? You probably can't read it unless you can read Hebrew. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I dropped this Hebrew in Google Translate, and Google Translate gave me back the wrong translation. And so what this suggested to me is in supervised or unsupervised natural language processing systems, you can basically poison the data. I could put anything back because they ask you, Google responds back, give me a good translation. I could have thrown anything in there. What we are doing in the background is taking similar examples and poisoning the data, inducing bias, as it were, into these systems. And it's very easy. So you can get a text, extract the data out, but is it the right context? You can impact the context by poisoning data with bias and in essence, corrupt said data. Norse, anyone know about Norse? And I want to cast shade if former Norse employees are here, but a well-intended company at this particular time, there was an article or a white paper released about this attack on Iran. Krebs kind of commented on it, said, you know, if you looked at the document, looked at all the data, basically it's full of bias, and so as a consumer of threat intelligence and consumer of such said data and bartering with barters back and forth about what to purchase, how much bias can I detect? In this situation, this is probably the worst of the situations where this entire particular article was filled with bias and not intended, without the intended outcome was not as it was ought to be. We took this conversation, Will and I, Will who's not here today, we took this conversation onto Security Weekly with Paul Asadurian and John Strand. John Strand was on the call, kind of sitting back the entire time we're having this conversation about, can you hack it, can you not hack it? John said, this conversation makes no sense at all. Why are we talking about threat intelligence? Most people don't even know about their own environments. And so basically he held us to task because, yes, we're concerned about the hype cycle and what vendors are trying to sell us, but at the end of the day, are the buyers of said threat intel or the collectors of said threat intel, do they know anything about their own environments? And basically, it's do you know thyself, right? The best practice is that the best path forward to kind of circumvent what's happening from the outside in. Attackers, ghost stories? Yes, I see one hand. And then nightmares of a pen tester. Anybody? If you've not read these two slides or these commentaries on knowing your environment, I would suggest that you read these two. As you think about threat intel, basically, if you follow the recommendations in these two decks, you will basically wipe out 98% of your threat surface, I guarantee you. And then there's also the Dirty Dozen by the Cloud Security Alliance, just released, that talks about growing threat activity in the clouds and how clouds are being attacked in certain ways that you ought to know about. So this is all, for me, very important because you've got to, I think, know yourself before you can really engage in threat intel. And I say that because of this one quote here from Danny Wood at Cyber Reason. We were conversing about this about 2 weeks ago, and basically she told me threat intelligence received yesterday is already irrelevant. Now, what does that mean? I don't do a lot with props when I'm giving talks, but I wore this shirt in particular. As you can see in my shirt, I have Duo. I was in the throes of a nation-state attack, and the assessor on site at the time said to me, Mark, they attacked you and 3 other folks at the same time. If you had Duo or something like Duo, you might have slowed down the attack. Now, the fact that he told me, was enlightening to me, but it was already irrelevant, right? Because I didn't know my environment. Well, I knew the environment. I knew the environment. I mean, be transparent, the environment was crap. But and so we got what we deserved. But if we had known ourselves and had the threat intelligence at a relevant time, perhaps we would have thwarted or slowed down the attack. And so hacking intelligence, I'm not sure that was my point to Will. I said, it's cost, it's bureaucratic, it's knowing yourself to get around some of this resistance or impedance to understanding how to protect oneself with threat intelligence. So, yes, these are kind of Will's slides here. So, do we really know what intelligence is, right? And then you keep using that word, but I don't think you know what it means. So, how do we answer the question of what threat intel is? So, him coming from the military community would suggest that we've defined it improperly. And so, how do we course correct the conversation by providing the right definitions around what intelligence is? Most of us that are concerned with intelligence, are we doing it the right way? Are we pursuing it because it has a net effect on our organizations, our partners, and people, or are we pursuing it because it has become fashionable to do so? And then why is it, why in the last decade is there an uptick on doing intelligence? Has it become important because we're being told from marketers or enterprises, understanding that it's something that we have to do, or is it just, the thing of the day? And then do we understand what intelligence tradecraft is? Are organizations understanding the core or the fundamental rudimentary tenets of what tradecraft is? Are we equipped and capable of conducting it? So there are two foundational definitions from the field, one from the Dictionary of the United States of Military Terms for Joint Usage, which suggests that intelligence is the product resulting from the collection, evaluation, analysis, and integration, and interpretation of all available information which concerns one or more aspects of foreign nations or of areas of operation, and which is immediately or potentially significant to planning. And then in the training handbook, it writes, intelligence is the same thing. It's a product resulting from the collection, evaluation, correlation, kind of similar. And Will kind of added his own twist to this by saying, intelligence is the collection of information, unqualified, which is then processed, vetted, tested for veracity, deduplicated, normalized, enriched, and analyzed for military or political value, for domestic and foreign applications, and as a part of CI operations. In other words, intelligence is information, data that has been collected via a variety of methods from a variety of sources, understanding of events, individuals, orgs, movements, and governments. It is both process and a consumable actionable product. So process and product. I mean, it's not threat intel if it's just a product. There's got to be a process. It's got to be process and product. We're typically taught that it's a product, but it's a process and product. Some of the tenets that he raises are these. If we look at this list, if you just peruse it for just a moment, which of these do we normally hear when we're talking to vendors? And I'm not trying to cast shade on vendors. I'm just trying to say this is the larger list of intelligence components that are at the foundation of threat intelligence. So at this list, which ones normally are talked about? I hear OSINT, SIGINT, and right, those three, right? What about the others? Do they normally come up? When you think about it, do we think about the others that are on this list? And so Will points this out as a challenge to the conversation in that we basically have a conversation around a portion or a smaller percentage of what the overall disciplines or the tenets that underlie the disciplines are typically focused on those three. And I said to Will, when we're talking to vendors or talking to each other, can we, I don't know, as like many of you go to RSA, whatever, you walk the floor, I see vendors. Am I bashing vendors too much today? I'm not trying to bash vendors, but I get concerned when I see, threat intelligence, but then last year you were selling me something other. But then threat intelligence gets me to the booth. But what kind of threat intelligence is it? Is it OSINT? Is it HUMINT? Is it SIGINT? Is it SIBINT? Is it FININT? I mean, kind of peeling back the onions and having these larger conversations. And then from the linguistic side of this conversation, can I inform the underlying tenets with things like named entity recognition, NLP? We're talking a lot about machine learning and data science to kind of make this conversation more fruitful for those who are faced with barriers at getting such threat intel. More conversations, more questions that Will would ask the group. Why are we doing threat intel today? And for those of you in the room, how many actually have mature threat intel programs? You can raise it. I see a couple of hands. How many of you would like to have mature threat intel programs? How many of you are not even having the conversation? Me too, at this cloud company. So my manager says to me, is threat intelligence something that we should do? I'm like, okay, that's the wrong question. That's the wrong question. For those of you who are doing threat intel, those of you who are trying to mature threat intel, what are the drivers? Is it miscreant behavior? Is it the evolution and maturity of cyber criminals? ABTs, is that a bad word? Yes or no? Nation state proxy, nation state, over-aggressive marketing entities. If I had to poll the room, which ones would be top on your list? I have ABT, nation state. Some said marketing. It depends on what org you're actually in. So that's, I like what you said. When I was with those group of CISOs 2 weeks ago, they said, as you're embarking upon this conversation around threat intelligence, don't look outside for the inside story. That was Mike Towers from Allergan. A lot of us, maybe going back to knowing thyself, do we know what org we are, and are we basing our conversations based on the org or the verticals that we reside in? Typically, it's been aggressive marketing, or you find yourself in a compromise. I've been in both situations, where now it's like, okay, we should have had these items in place, or these particular staples in place to mitigate some of the challenges. But it's a murky market, a murky story, but a conversation that is to be had. We talked about military definitions as in comparison to our current definitions. When we talk about threat intelligence, do we think about TRADECRAFT? And so Will says, most of us are down the path, but down the path incorrectly because we don't understand TRADECRAFT. When we talk about threat intelligence, do we understand what TRADECRAFT means? Techniques, methods, technologies that were used in espionage. And so in that sense, if you look at the circle to the right, there's planning, there's collection, there's processing and exploitation, there's analysis and production. Again, there's that word produce something, dissemination and integration, circled by evaluation and feedback. So the feedback loops that would enrich the conversation, directed at espionage. But when you look at it from an information cyber security perspective, it's kind of similar: techniques, methods, and technologies used in defending organizations, personnel, and their interests against adversaries, internal and the like. Does this sound close to what the definition should be like? We have these underlying tenets again that should be informing the process and the ways that we're going about in such programs. We'll suggest that in any program that understands the underlying tenets of TRADECRAFT, when you translate that into an information cybersecurity context, that it should have similar bullets as a part of that program. So understanding the intelligence of the life cycle, collections, hunting. Hunting is the big thing now, adversarial profiling, looking at organization personal profiling, again, understanding the inside story before looking outside for it, analytics, production, and workflows. I don't want to read through all of this, but these will be available. But when you're looking at defining the program, it should have some elements of all of these as a part of the program. What is the future then of intelligence, or what's happening right now? I'm liking what Rick Howard is saying over at Palo Alto. The norm for us is sharing. We're always trying to get around this through sharing. There was a gentleman by the name of Sergio Castelnegro who wrote on his blog that sharing, in essence, is enriching the collectors and not so much those who need to benefit by that. But sharing is typically the way that we go about this. Most of us, Rick says, have no idea if we have multiple controls in place down the kill chain for specific adversaries. We can kind of treat security controls as a giant set of things to prevent and detect instead of focusing on the adversary. So we're buying things, we're focusing on controls instead of focusing on the adversaries. So I'm not sure if any of you in the room have seen this yet, but the playbooks from Unit 42 in the room, anyone? I have one hand. Unit 42 playbooks take a different approach to this. So typically we have 1 or 2 run books. But what would an organization, what would it be like to have multiple run books for multiple adversaries? So if you know who's targeting you, and it's not just one actor, but it's multiple actors or two or a handful of actors, Rick Howard and the folks at Unit 42 are suggesting that you have run books for each pertinent adversary. And so even the controls that you have today, the controls that you have today may not be the controls you use tomorrow. Maybe you have a modular set of controls based on the actors that are happening. So if you look at this particular example, there is one particular threat actor, SOPHICY, and then the various things that you should have in place for this particular actor. How many campaigns are out there? What exploits are they using? What should you have or be looking at in your environment for this particular actor? And so the tendency has been to, buy for all the actors as opposed to taking a more modular approach because the actors are different potentially each day for your particular org at a particular time. And so to move modularly, have multiple run books, be pliable in the approach. The desired outcomes of the conversation, having talked to Will last night, would be these. There are barriers. Many in the room are trying to get to some modicum of threat intel or something that resembles that for their orgs. How do we help people overcome some of the barriers to getting to the relevant intel for their particular organizations? And then expand the conversations, somewhat. I want to hear more, from Will's side of the room about the underlying tenets, the fundamental definitions that ought to be impacting or influencing the conversation. We only talk about 3 of the ents. There are maybe 8 we saw on the board, maybe others from my side of the house, using other disciplines to inform the way those fundamental tenets have framed the conversation around threat intel, extracting it from the military context and putting it into the information security context. Building, Will would have us, I would believe, to build intel practices on those foundational tenets. And then vendor transparency. I can speak from that position because I used to be a vendor. I used to sell the intel. We just wanted to get, let me back up. Let me back up. Don't throw stones, don't throw bricks or anything. And some days it was about getting the PO, but for me, being a consumer, a practitioner, and a seller, if the vendor and consumer conversations could be more transparent, more open, peel back the onions, what is it that you're actually selling me? And when you sell it to me, does it do exactly what it needs to do for my particular environment, for my particular frame of reference? Can I talk about the multiple run books? Is it pliable for my particular organization or vertical? And so with that, I kind of flew by because I'm by myself up here, but thank you for listening to the conversation. We have a lot of time left, so there's a few questions, or I have a question here.
Well, so one point that you brought up, you have to start knowing your environment. And this all then leads into one thing: intelligence is useless if it's not actionable.
Yeah, I didn't use that term, but yes, you're correct.
Okay, I just know if you were going to talk about that at all.
It didn't come up in the initial conversation, but it is in the background of the conversation about it being actionable, being not just collecting, because we can define the process, we can unearth the military definitions, but at the end of the day, after that loop is complete, is it actionable?
Yeah, okay.
Question?
Do you think MITRE's attack framework, if you're familiar with that, will be useful to help the industry try to focus more on the types of intelligence to collect to more effectively do detection and response?
I do know what it is. I absolutely love it. I think with.
Excuse me, would you mind repeating the question? We can't hear.
I'm sorry. So he asked about MITRE's attack framework. If you can go out there and look that up, but it's a framework that kind of talks about how attackers are using what particular processes or techniques and tactics in various situations. So he's asking if that would be something useful to help enhance our detection and response, and I would say emphatically yes. And then I've worked with a few vendors who are already under the hood, ingesting or using that framework in terms of enhancing their product for public consumption. But I also see it making sense in what Unit 42 is doing. For me, that's one of the most innovative changes if they get there. And it's not probably something we can all do, but be pliable. Can I have multiple sets of controls? Maybe it's not cost efficient to have that, but being pliable enough to say maybe I use product A from September to December, but I see we've got some predictable analysis down the road that suggests that we flip the switch and move over to another set of controls. Typically, we have a static set of controls. If there are no other questions, thank you.